Hi, this is Celia Lacayo with LA Social Science. I am currently the Associate Director of Community Engagement, as well as teaching in the Chicano and Central American Studies, as well as the African American Studies Department. So today we have with us three amazing researchers and scholars who have written a new book, and they include Rebecca Jean Emigh from the Sociology Department here at UCLA, as well as Patricia Ahmed from South Dakota State, and Dylan Riley from Berkeley. And they have written a cutting-edge research book entitled How Everyday Forms of Racial Categorization Survive Imperialist Censuses in Puerto Rico. Hello, everyone, and we will get right underway. So, Rebecca, can you please tell us what is the main argument and contribution of the book?
You know, the book really shows how ordinary, everyday people affect official classification. And that's really surprising, since mostly we think about official classification coming from states and state actors. You know, they design it and they collect that information, and those categories shape what we do. But what we do is we take a comparative and historical perspective, which you really have to do to uncover these effects of ordinary actors. And we show that they really do have a big influence. You know, this is a really important topic. There's a lot of debate about, what censuses do. And I think scholars, realize now that those censuses or registers or surveys, they don't just collect information that exists. They don't just go out and gather information that already exists. The very collection of that information really affects the reality around us. And this literature is called the sociology of statistics, is what people have been calling it. So those official information gathering attempts really shape the reality that they purport to report. But, at another level, there's a huge debate about how that reality is created and which actors create it. And, as I've already mentioned, I think that most people sort of take for granted, and then this has been kind of bolstered by a lot of studies in the sociology of statistics, that it's really these state actors that have the biggest role. And that even, states are little Foucauldian panopticons that are watching everything that we do and collect all this information. And, that certainly may be true in certain cases, especially, maybe in cases where there really is, intensive surveillance. But what we show in this book is something quite different, that states are actually quite limited in what they can collect, and they're very dependent on these social actors. And in fact, these social actors' agendas really come through in this data collection process. And so in this book in particular, we're really looking at a special and one particular outcome, that is, are census categories transformative? That is, do the categories themselves sort of shape how people think and act, once they have that information? Are they sort of constrained to act in that particular way? And what we show is the opposite, that in Puerto Rico, there were centuries, literally, of censuses that were collected, but they didn't transform the everyday categories that actors used on the ground. And that's because the census categories weren't really in the social actors' interests, and especially categories of race. And so the ordinary actors, non-elites, just continued to use their own everyday categories. And, they knew and understood these census categories, but for practical purposes, they just sort of ignored them. They just weren't in their interest to take up and use. So it's a really powerful case that shows that states really depend on social actors taking up and using those categories.
And so along those lines, as you're saying that these everyday forms of racial categorization in Puerto Rico and the census, how they compare, can you elaborate on why this is important?
Yeah, so I think that I think it's wide known that in the Caribbean, in Latin America, Central America, South America, I think it's well known that racial categories are quite different than in the US. And in particular, the racial categories are more often continuous. There's a lot of categories. And they do shades from sort of light to dark. And they're not just skin color, but also take account of other phenotypical characteristics, hair, eye color, facial features. So I think that part's well known, that in everyday life, those racial categories are used. But Puerto Rico really presents a very interesting sort of test case about these census categories. Puerto Rico was the case where the Spanish and then the US collected really the most censuses of any colonial case. So the Spaniards did have colonial censuses elsewhere in their purview, but they were redacted relatively infrequently. But in Puerto Rico, wow, the Puerto Rico administrators were just incredibly great census takers, really some of the best that we've seen anywhere in the world. They collected those censuses, year after year after year, and in really great detail. They collected occupation pretty early. They collected racial categories. They collected nationality and place of origin, pretty early historically, and they just did them a lot. So if anywhere in the Spanish colonies, these census categories should have had an effect. It really should have been in Puerto Rico, where there were just all of these censuses collected. So we've kind of picked Puerto Rico as this really important test case. If these state theories about censuses are right, we really should have seen some effect of these state censuses in transforming these everyday categories. But quite the contrary, we don't. In fact, people became familiar with the census categories, which were generally translated into English something like white, brown, and black. They were usually tripartite, and people were familiar with them and they could use them. It's not that they were unfamiliar with them, but they never replaced those fluid, continuous categories that were used in everyday life. So this is a really important case just to show the limits of the transformative effects of the census racial categories when they're really not in the social actors' interest. Those census categories would have in many ways really further limited upward mobility, and especially once the US started to collect censuses, really would have introduced sort of a whole new stratification system that really wasn't in the social actors' interest. So it's a really key and important case to explore these kind of effects.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You all ran across some unpublished documents that were critical for your book. Patricia, can you tell us what do these unpublished documents reveal about the power of social actors and the state?
Yes, we used a variety of documents to explore this relationship. These documents included censuses, for the most part, of households. And they, as Rebecca indicated, they had lots of different variables. So information on household members, race, nationality, other demographic variables. And wherever possible, we tried to look at the actual household declarations. But wherever this was not possible, we did use census summaries, and these were all conducted by the actual Puerto Rican officials. So what these unpublished documents do is they really reveal very powerfully that the state itself was not an all-powerful entity that could construct and impose its own version of social reality on societies in keeping with its interest. The data clearly show that the weakest state in our set, the mercantilist Spanish state, was the state that was able to do the most in terms of transformation. when it was doing censuses, it created legal categories, including the term vecino, which indicated a European who had full legal rights. And these categories really meshed very well with the Europeans who were there as colonists, as well as, spoke to their interest very well. And because of this, these categories became very transformative. We see these categories being used over and over and over again and actually being used in everyday life. There were race categories that were used during this particular period, but they did tend to reflect the kind of nascent, popular understanding of race in Puerto Rico as very fluid and varied. Now, with respect to the two stronger states, United States and Imperialist Spain, they really couldn't do any transformative censuses, if you will. They tried to impose these tripartite racial categories of white, black, colored, mixed, but they didn't really resonate very well with the Puerto Rican understanding of race as something fluid, something that varies from time to time. And if you look at the earliest Spanish imperialist censuses, they were showing that they were kind of going by the popular understanding because they used all these different categories of, different shades of color and different descriptions of people of different races. But as the Spanish state decided that it was going to kind of follow this ideology of white supremacy more and impose these very restrictive binary and tripartite categories, the people resisted. These categories, first of all, didn't resonate with their fluid understanding of race. And then the second thing was that these categories didn't really speak to their elite interest either, because white was considered to be kind of an elite status. And therefore, if you make almost everybody in Puerto Rico non-white, if you make them black or colored or mixed or some very restrictive category like that, they're not white, so they can't access that status. So what this did counterintuitively with the United States census and the Spanish imperialist census, even though they were very strong states and really trying to impose this ideology on the Puerto Rican people, it had the opposite effect. What they saw was an intensification of whitening in the census. Puerto Ricans didn't want to pick black or mixed race because they didn't want to be put into a lower status because of their color. So over time, this intensified dramatically. So if you look at, say, the mercantilist census of 1530 in that was conducted by Mercantilist Spain, only 10% of the respondents indicated that they were white. But if you look at the 1864 imperialist census conducted by Spain, you'll see that 64% of people in Puerto Rico identified as white. So this really had a contradictory effect. It didn't really match the state's intentions. I mean, they were trying to impose this kind of white supremacist ideology on the people of Puerto Rico, but it didn't work. It actually had the counter effect. More people identified as white than colored or mixed or black. So therefore, these findings from these documents that we looked at clearly show that when it comes to censuses, states aren't all powerful. They just can't impose their will on everyday people. If the census categories don't resonate with the lay categories, or if they don't mesh well with people's everyday interest, it just doesn't work.
Thank you so much, Patricia. So, Dylan, can you tell us how this book pertains to contemporary times and why it is a critical book for everyone to read and certainly for professors to assign to their students?
I just wanted to say I'm going to take a step back from what's been said so far, because most of the substantive issues of the book have already been discussed. But I wanted to just make a couple of points. I mean, the first one is just the pervasiveness of information gathering in contemporary society, obviously, makes the book of, relevance, continuing relevance. Obviously, in the U.S. every year, we're gathering a census every 10 years. There's a massive kind of scholarly and popular literature that emerges around that, particularly around questions of race and ethnicity and the census. And so, it's definitely behooves people to think carefully about what these processes really mean. As Rebecca and Patricia were both saying, what in particular the kind of meaning of this new idea of the social construction of ethnic and racial categories through the censuses actually tells us about the strength or lack of strength of states and those kind of things. So for that reason, I think it's of importance. One of the things that's really distinctive about our book that I'd like to bring out, though, is that we really use in this book, kind of the tools of comparative and historical sociology in a fairly careful way to really think about, obviously, the relationship between states and societies around official information gathering. And that's actually been pretty rare, I would say, in the literature on censuses. Most of that literature has not really been formally comparative, even when sometimes it talks about different cases. But what we really tried to do with the case of Puerto Rico, which, as you'll see in the book, is actually divided into 3 cases in our analysis, is to really investigate the relative strength of states in these different periods, and then ask the question, well, was it really, as Patricia was saying, is it really the case where when the state is strongest that it's most transformative in its categories? And as Patricia is saying, what we find is that in fact it's precisely where the state is weakest that it's most transformative. So that raises, I think, a real issue about how we should think about what might be thought of as the implicit causal narrative that's become pretty dominant in the field of the sociology of statistics, which is highly kind of state-centered. So what we're doing is we're using basically the tools of comparative sociology to hopefully broaden and pluralize, in the sense, the ways in which we think about causality in this domain of the sociology of statistics. And so really, hopefully, what our book will do is to stimulate students to think about these processes in quite new ways, and hopefully to conduct, further research on censuses, cadasters, registers, other examples of official information gathering, and really use the tools of comparison and analysis to try to understand how these things actually work or do not work to transform social life. And so I would guess I guess the one thing to say in closing, I would just like to emphasize one point that Patricia made about how important the Puerto Rican case is in this, and the kind of discussion about that case. This issue of whitening, of course, is really, really decisive. I mean, it has been documented in work prior to ours, but of course, if you think about it, it runs exactly counter to the kind of state-centered narrative that's dominant in the sociology of statistics. We, with our comparative and historical approach, I think we really show how to think about this very important finding in a quite new way. And I think it sets off a more open discussion about what's actually happening with the sociology of official statistics than has sort of unfolded hitherto.
Thank you so much, and we thank you for joining us today with LA Social Science Book Series. Remember to subscribe to LA Social Science, and we will catch you next time. Thank you.